They said a blind man couldn't fight back. But on Whitfield Plantation, Josiah proved them wrong. He was born in darkness, serving a master who believed cruelty was his right, who laughed as Josiah's wife was whipped for disrespect. They thought blindness made him weak. It made him dangerous. Josiah began to whisper at night, just soft enough for guilt to sound like ghosts. Chairs moved on their own. Doors creaked without wind, and Colonel Whitfield started praying to a God who had stopped listening. No one saw the truth until it was too late. The blind slave wasn't cursed. He was clever. Every sound, every shadow, every scream was part of the trap he built in silence. And when the master ran into the swamp, chasing his own fear, Josiah didn't follow to save him. He followed to listen, as justice finally took its breath. Because blindness wasn't Josiah's curse. It was his weapon. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The Mississippi heat pressed down like a smothering blanket, heavy and unyielding. Inside the plantation workshop, wood shavings curled beneath Josiah's skilled fingers as he carved another spoon from cherry wood. Though blind since childhood, his hands knew the shape of things better than most men with sight. He traced the smooth curve of the handle, listening to the scrape of his small knife against the grain. Ruth hummed softly nearby, the familiar melody floating between them like a private language. The scent of cornmeal and butter filled the air as she prepared the evening's bread. Outside, cicadas screamed their summer chorus, their rhythm broken only by bursts of laughter from the main house porch. "That tune," Josiah said quietly, his fingers never stopping their work. "Your grandmother taught you that?" "Mm-hmm," Ruth answered, her voice low and warm. "Said it was older than slavery. Said it came from across the water." Josiah nodded, feeling the weight of things unsaid between them. Their moments alone were precious and rare. Stolen breaths between Colonel Whitfield's demands. He could sense Ruth's movements as she worked, the way her skirts rustled against the rough floor, the slight catch in her humming when she bent to stir the batter. The distant laughter grew louder. Boots thumped across the wooden porch of the main house. "They coming," Josiah whispered, his hands stilling on the half-finished spoon. Ruth's humming stopped abruptly. "How many?" "4, maybe 5 men," he answered, his head slightly tilted. His ears could pick out individual footsteps, the specific cadence of Colonel Whitfield's stride, confident and unhurried, the walk of a man who owned everything his eyes could see. The workshop door swung open with a bang. Sunlight flooded in, bringing with it the smell of brandy and cigars. "There he is!" Colonel Silas Whitfield's voice boomed. "Gentlemen, this is the one I told you about, my blind boy with the devil's own ears." Josiah lowered his head, setting his knife and spoon carefully on the workbench beside him. He folded his hands in his lap, his face blank and still as pond water. "Stand up, Josiah," Whitfield commanded. "Show the gentleman what you can do." Josiah rose slowly to his feet. He was tall but kept his shoulders hunched, making himself appear smaller than he was, a habit learned through pain. "These are important men from Charleston," Whitfield continued. The floorboards creaked as he stepped closer. "Mr. Harrington here owns 300 souls on his rice plantation. And Judge Bellamy is thinking of investing in our county." "Good afternoon, sirs," Josiah said quietly, his cloudy eyes staring at nothing. Someone chuckled. "He's well-mannered for a blind one. Usually they're simple in the head." "Not this one," Whitfield said proudly, as if discussing a prized horse. "Josiah here can hear a coin drop from clear across the room. Can tell you what kind of coin it is just by the sound." He turned toward Josiah. "Tell them about your ears, boy." Josiah swallowed. "The Lord took my eyes but gave me good ears, master." "And what else can you do?" Whitfield pressed. Tell them. Ruth had gone very still by the hearth, her hands frozen in the cornmeal. Josiah could feel her tension like a wire stretched between them. I can make bird calls, Josiah said softly. And I carve spoons. The bird calls, Whitfield laughed. Gentlemen, you haven't lived until you've heard this. Josiah, give us a whippoorwill. Josiah's throat tightened. He cupped his hands around his mouth and produced the mournful call of a whippoorwill, the sound rising and falling with eerie precision. Now, a mockingbird, Whitfield demanded. Josiah complied, the mockingbird's varied trills echoing through the small workshop. One of the men whistled in appreciation. That's something to hear. Now, do the sound of a whip, Whitfield said, his voice dropping lower, the one that makes the field hands jump. Josiah's hands trembled at his sides. He knew this game, the one that made white men laugh and reminded him of his place. He pressed his lips together and made the sharp, cutting sound of a bullwhip snapping through air. "Crack it again!" someone called out. Josiah repeated the sound, each crack making Ruth's breath catch. He could feel her anger from across the room, hot as stove iron. You see? Better than a circus act, Whitfield boasted. Cost me $800 when he was just a boy, but he's earned his keep in entertainment alone. Something small and metal sailed through the air. Josiah heard it spinning before it struck his chest and dropped to the floor with a distinct ring. Can you tell what that is, blind man? A voice challenged. Josiah tilted his head, listening to the coin's fading vibration against the floorboards. A silver dollar, sir. New minting. Well, I'll be damned, the man laughed. Without warning, Ruth's footsteps crossed the room. The rustle of her skirts, the sound of her bending down, then rising. Josiah's heart hammered in his chest. Your coin, sir, Ruth said quietly, her voice carefully empty of emotion. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. Did I ask you to move, woman? Whitfield's voice had turned to ice. No, master, Ruth answered. The slap echoed like a gunshot. Josiah flinched, but remained frozen in place, his unseeing eyes wide with fear. You forget yourself, Whitfield snarled. Thinking you can approach my guests without permission? I'm sorry, master, Ruth whispered. You'll be sorrier tomorrow, Whitfield promised. Now get back to your work before I decide to make an example of you tonight instead. The men departed shortly after, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. The workshop door slammed shut, leaving Josiah and Ruth alone in the stifling heat once more. Night fell slowly, bringing with it dark clouds that blotted out the stars. Thunder growled in the distance as Josiah and Ruth lay side by side on their thin pallet in the cabin they shared with 3 other enslaved families. Everyone else was asleep, their breathing the only sound besides the coming storm. You shouldn't have done that, Josiah whispered, his fingers finding Ruth's in the darkness. I couldn't watch them treat you like that, Ruth whispered back. Not again. Thunder rumbled closer now, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the cabin's wooden roof. He'll hurt you tomorrow, Josiah said, his voice breaking. Ruth turned toward him, her hand reaching up to touch his face. We will survive, she whispered fiercely. Together, no matter how long it takes. Josiah took her hand and pressed it to his lips. I'll find a way to protect you, he promised. Somehow. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. The first light of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when the plantation bell began to toll, its harsh clang shattering the morning stillness. Josiah's eyes opened to darkness, the same darkness he had known for 25 years. Beside him, Ruth stirred, her breathing quick with fear. It's too early for the work bell, she whispered. Josiah sat up, his head tilted as he sorted through the morning sounds. Footsteps approached their cabin. Heavy boots, not the bare feet of field workers. Metal clinked against metal with each step. Chains, he murmured, reaching for Ruth's hand. The cabin door crashed open. Other sleepers jolted awake, children whimpering in confusion. Josiah felt Ruth's fingers tighten around his. "Ruth?" Overseer Briggs's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Get up. Colonel wants you at the post." The cabin went silent except for the soft crying of a child quickly hushed by its mother. Ruth's hand slipped from Josiah's as she stood. "What for?" Josiah asked, his voice remarkably steady, despite the fear churning in his gut. The overseer spat. "Not your place to ask, blind man. Colonel says she showed disrespect to his guests yesterday. Time she learned her place." Josiah rose to his feet. "Please." A boot connected with his chest, sending him sprawling back onto the pallet. "You stay put," Briggs ordered. "Colonel says you're to listen. Says maybe then you'll remember to keep your woman in line." Ruth's voice came soft but clear. "It's all right, Josiah. I'll be all right." The sound of her footsteps moved away, followed by Briggs's heavier tread. The door slammed shut, leaving Josiah in a silence broken only by the frightened breathing of the others. "Old man Moses," Josiah called, reaching a hand out in the darkness. "Help me up." Gnarled fingers found his, pulling him to his feet. "Nothing you can do, son," Moses whispered, his voice thick with grief already. "Nothing any of us can do." Josiah stumbled to the door, his hands finding the rough wood. Outside, he heard Ruth being led across the yard toward the field where the whipping post stood. Colonel Whitfield's voice carried on the morning air, speaking words Josiah couldn't make out. The chains rattled as Ruth was secured to the post. Someone touched Josiah's shoulder. Esther, Moses's wife. "Come away from the door," she urged. "Don't torture yourself." Josiah shook his head. "I need to hear," he said. "I need to remember." The first crack of the whip cut through the dawn like summer lightning. Ruth made no sound. The second lash fell, then the third. On the fourth, a small cry escaped her lips. Josiah's hands pressed against the door until splinters dug into his palms. Each lash burned itself into his memory. The specific pitch, the exact moment of impact, the sound of Ruth's breath catching before she cried out. He counted them, one by one, until they reached 20. The morning work bell rang, and feet shuffled around him as the others prepared to leave the cabin. Moses touched his shoulder again. "We have to go to the fields. They'll be looking for us." Josiah nodded blindly. "Go." Left alone, he made his way to the small table where he kept his carving tools. His fingers found a knife, gripping it as the sounds from outside continued. Ruth's cries had grown weaker, barely audible now beneath the regular fall of the whip. Josiah's hands shook so violently that the knife slipped, slicing deep into his palm. Hot blood welled up, but he barely felt the pain. It was nothing compared to what Ruth endured outside. The morning stretched into afternoon. Briggs came for Josiah eventually, dragging him to the workshop where he was ordered to continue his carving. Blood from his cut hand stained the wood as he worked, his ears straining for any sound of Ruth. As evening approached, Josiah heard Moses's shuffling steps outside the workshop. "Josiah," the old man's voice broke on his name. "She's gone, son." Ruth passed not an hour ago. The spoon Josiah had been carving clattered to the floor. "Where?" was all he could ask. "They're burying her now, behind the cotton field." No ceremony, no words. "I slipped away to tell you." Josiah stood, his hands reaching for his walking stick. "Take me there." Moses hesitated. Briggs said, "Please," Josiah whispered. "I need to say goodbye." The old man's calloused hand clasped his elbow, guiding him from the workshop. They moved quietly along the edge of the fields, avoiding the main paths where they might be seen. The smell of freshly turned earth reached Josiah's nose before they stopped. "Here," Moses said softly. "They just finished." Josiah dropped to his knees, his hands finding the mound of loose soil. It was still warm from the day's heat. His fingers dug in slightly, feeling the texture, memorizing this place by touch. "Ruth," he whispered, her name like a prayer on his lip. "Ruth!" Moses shifted uncomfortably behind him. "I should get back before they notice. Will you be all right, finding your way?" "Yes," Josiah answered, not moving from the grave. "Thank you, Moses." When the old man's footsteps faded, Josiah bent lower, his forehead nearly touching the dirt. "I may be blind," he vowed, his words barely audible even to himself, "but I'll make him see. I swear it, Ruth. I swear it." He remained there until darkness fell, his hands memorizing every inch of the small mound, creating a map in his mind that he would never forget. Finally, he rose and made his way back to the cabin, guided by sounds and smells he had known for years. Night settled over the plantation. Through the thin cabin walls, Josiah could hear the creak of the big house in the distance, the whisper of wind through the trees, the soft breathing of sleeping bodies around him. He sat awake on his pallet, his back against the wall, listening. Every sound seemed clearer now, as if Ruth's death had sharpened his already keen hearing. The subtle shift of the colonel's house as it cooled in the night air, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of mice in the corn crib. His cut palm throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Josiah tilted his head, listening to the world around him as if it were speaking directly to him, telling him secrets only he could hear. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of wind became a note in a melody he was just beginning to understand. His fingers traced the dried blood on his palm, following the line of the cut. The pain felt distant now, overshadowed by the hollow ache in his chest where Ruth had been. He waited, perfectly still, as the night deepened around him. Night had settled fully over the plantation, a thick blanket of darkness punctuated only by the faint silver glow of a quarter moon. The Whitfield mansion stood tall against the sky, its white columns ghostly in the moonlight. From the shadows near the garden, Josiah listened to the house settling, each creak and groan as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. In his palm, he clutched something small and precious, Ruth's locket, a simple copper thing with no picture inside, just a lock of her hair. She had hidden it for years, the one possession Colonel Whitfield didn't know about. Moses had pressed it into Josiah's hand after the burial. "Found it sewn into her dress," the old man had whispered. "Thought you should have it." Now Josiah's fingers traced its outline, memorizing every scratch and dent. The metal had warmed against his skin, almost as if it carried Ruth's heat still. The house creaked again. Through the open window of the kitchen, Josiah could hear Celia, the cook, finishing her night duties. Soon she would leave, and the back door would remain unlocked for the morning servants. He waited, patient as stone, until Celia's footsteps faded toward the slave quarters. Then he moved, his walking stick tapping softly to guide him up the familiar path to the kitchen door. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and the lingering aromas of the evening's dinner, roast pork and sweet potatoes. Josiah moved through the kitchen without his stick now, his hands ghosting over countertops and chairs he had memorized through years of cleaning and serving. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as he climbed the back stairs, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked under weight. He carried a cleaning rag as his excuse should anyone discover him, though he knew the white folks rarely questioned why a slave was working at odd hours. The upper hallway stretched before him, the colonel's bedroom at the far end. Josiah paused outside Whitfield's door, listening to the man's heavy breathing. Not quite asleep yet. Josiah pressed his lips close to the crack beneath the door. "Ruth," he whispered, so softly it might have been the wind. "Ruth." Inside, the colonel shifted in his bed. Josiah moved on, touching the small table in the hallway. With careful hands, he turned a decorative vase a quarter-inch to the left. At the window, he tilted the mirror hanging there just slightly upward. In Mrs. Whitfield's empty sitting room, the colonel's wife being away visiting her sister, Josiah moved a chair 3 inches from its usual position. From her dressing table, he took a single candle, slipping it into his pocket. Back in the hallway, he paused again at the colonel's door. Whitfield's breathing had deepened into sleep. "Look what you did," Josiah whispered through the crack. "Look what you did to her." He descended the stairs and slipped out the way he had come. Ruth's locket clutched tightly in his palm. The next morning, as Josiah sat in the workshop carving, he heard the colonel shouting from the house. "Who's been in my room?" Whitfield's voice carried across the yard. "Someone was in my room last night." Josiah's fingers never paused in their work, shaping wood with the same steady rhythm as always. But beneath his calm exterior, something dark and satisfied unfurled. That evening, while polishing silver in the dining room, Josiah overheard the colonel telling his foreman he'd awoken from terrible dreams. Dreams of a woman standing at the foot of his bed, her back torn open and bleeding. "Nonsense," the foreman replied. "Just your mind playing tricks after too much whiskey." 3 nights later, Josiah returned to the house. This time, he carried a small vial, Ruth's lavender water, the only luxury she'd ever had, given to her years ago by a kind visitor. Josiah had found it hidden beneath a loose board in their cabin. In the kitchen, he uncorked the vial and let 3 drops fall into the colonel's morning coffee grounds. Not enough to taste, just enough to carry the scent of Ruth into Whitfield's day. Upstairs, he moved through the rooms like a ghost, rearranging small objects, a book placed upside down, a pair of glasses moved to the wrong table. Outside the colonel's door, he dragged his fingernails lightly down the wood, a faint scratching that might have been rats in the walls. "She can't rest," he whispered. "Ruth can't rest." The following day, Josiah heard from Celia how the colonel had thrown his coffee cup across the room, claiming it smelled of death. That night, Whitfield woke the house shouting about someone standing in his room, though when his son checked, no one was there. "The master's losing his mind," Moses murmured to Josiah as they ate their morning cornmeal, jumping at shadows, hearing voices. "Is that so?" Josiah replied, his voice neutral. "Esther says Ruth's spirit is haunting him," Moses continued, lowering his voice. "Says she won't let him sleep until he pays for what he did." Word spread among the cabins. When misfortune struck the plantation, a spoiled barrel of salt pork, a horse gone lame, people nodded and whispered Ruth's name. Josiah said nothing, but his fingers caressed the locket he now wore hidden beneath his shirt. For 7 nights, he continued his work. A chair moved here, a whisper there. The scent of lavender worked into the colonel's pillowcase. Small things, insignificant alone, but together they created something powerful. The sense of a world slightly off its axis, of something watching from just beyond sight. On the 8th night, Josiah sat in the shadows of the slave garden, listening. The front door of the mansion opened, and footsteps paced across the wide porch. Colonel Whitfield's breathing came fast and uneven. "Who's there?" the colonel called, his voice cracking. "Show yourself!" Only cricket song answered him. "I know you're out there," Whitfield muttered, pacing back and forth. "Playing your tricks, moving my things. I'm not a fool." Josiah's lips curved into a smile that held no joy, only cold purpose. He leaned forward slightly. "Ruth," he whispered, letting the night breeze carry the name toward the porch. On the porch, the colonel's pacing stopped abruptly. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice higher now. "Who's there?" Josiah remained still, the locket warm against his chest. After a long moment, Whitfield retreated inside, slamming the door behind him. In the darkness, Josiah waited, patient as the grave. This was only the beginning. Dawn painted the eastern sky pink as the house servants moved quietly through the mansion. They spoke in hushed tones, their words drifting through the open windows to where Josiah swept fallen leaves from the porch steps. "Master ain't slept proper in near a week," whispered Esther, the head house servant. "Found him wandering the halls at 3 this morning, talking to himself." "Talking or arguing?" asked John, who polished the silver. "Both. 1 minute begging forgiveness, the next minute cursing and threatening." Esther's voice lowered further. "Something's eating at his soul, sure as anything." Josiah's broom never faltered in its steady rhythm, though his ears caught every word. The conversation shifted to other matters, but a new sound soon replaced it. Colonel Whitfield's voice, rising and falling in desperate prayer from his study. "Lord Almighty, cleanse this house of spirits," Whitfield pleaded, his words carrying clearly through the open window. "Drive away these demons that torment me. I am a God-fearing man, Lord, a righteous man." Josiah paused his sweeping, head tilted slightly. The colonel's voice cracked with fear. "I beg you, Lord, make her stop watching me. Make her voice cease. I cannot bear another night of this haunting." A smile ghosted across Josiah's lips before disappearing back into his usual blank expression. He resumed his sweeping, the broom scratching softly against the wooden boards. By midday, the plantation buzzed with news. Colonel Whitfield had summoned Overseer Briggs to his study, accused him of conspiring with unholy forces, and dismissed him on the spot. Briggs had stormed off the property, cursing Whitfield as a madman. "Never seen anything like it," Moses told Josiah as they ate their noon meal. "Briggs been with the colonel 15 years. Now he's gone because the master says he's helping ghosts." Josiah nodded, soaking a piece of cornbread in his bean soup. "The colonel seems troubled." "Troubled?" Moses snorted. "Man's lost his mind. Says someone's moving his things, whispering through the walls at night." He leaned closer. "Says he hears Ruth humming. Same tune she used to hum when working?" Josiah said nothing, but his fingers found the locket beneath his shirt. That afternoon, a carriage arrived bringing Preacher Hollis, summoned by Whitfield to bless the house and drive away what the colonel now openly called the vengeful spirit of that woman. The servants were ordered to clean everything twice over before the preacher arrived. Josiah, assigned to polish the wood in the parlor, listened as Whitfield paced and muttered, rehearsing what he would tell the preacher. The colonel's usual confidence had crumbled into twitchy anxiety. He jumped at small noises and kept glancing over his shoulder. When Preacher Hollis arrived, Whitfield greeted him with desperate relief. "Thank God you've come. This house has become a place of torment." The preacher, a tall, thin man with solemn eyes, followed Whitfield inside. Josiah continued his work, moving between rooms with quiet efficiency, always within earshot of the two men. "Something isn't right in this house," Preacher Hollis said, after touring the mansion. His voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there when he arrived. "There's a heaviness here, Colonel. A darkness." "Yes, exactly." Whitfield seized on the words. "You feel it too. I told you I wasn't imagining things." The preacher hesitated. "I don't speak of spirits, necessarily. I speak of sin, Colonel. This place, it reeks of sin." Silence fell between them. When Whitfield spoke again, his voice had hardened. "Are you accusing me of something, preacher?" "I make no accusations. I merely observe that where there is great suffering, there is often a reckoning." The preacher gathered his Bible. "I cannot help you, Colonel. Whatever troubles this house is beyond my power to cleanse." By sunset, the preacher was gone, and Whitfield's fear had twisted into rage. He smashed a decanter of whiskey against the wall and ordered everyone out of the house except for his personal manservant. That night, Josiah slipped back inside. This time he moved with purpose to Whitfield's study. From his pocket, he withdrew Ruth's locket. With careful fingers, he placed it inside the colonel's ledger book, marking the page where Whitfield had recorded Ruth's purchase price years ago. In the walls between the study and the colonel's bedroom, spaces Josiah knew intimately from years of cleaning, He whispered Ruth's favorite hymn, the one she'd sung while washing clothes. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." The words slipped through the cracks in the plaster like smoke, filling the darkness with their promise. 3 days passed. The colonel barely left his room, emerging only to gulp down whiskey and shout at servants. The plantation began to fall into disorder, without Briggs to manage it. Field hands worked slower. House servants exchanged knowing looks when Whitfield walked by muttering to himself. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. Rain hammered against the roof, and thunder shook the windows. Josiah waited until midnight before making his way to the edge of the cotton field, near the swamp where Ruth was buried. There, in the pouring rain, he began to hum. The same tune Ruth had hummed while making cornbread that first day. The sound carried on the wet wind toward the house, rising and falling with the storm. In the mansion, Colonel Whitfield bolted upright in bed, his nightshirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air. He listened, eyes wide with terror, as the humming filtered through his window. A woman's voice, soft and steady, coming from the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating his bedroom for a brief moment. In that instant, Whitfield saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. A woman with her back turned, her dress torn open to reveal bleeding wounds. With a strangled cry, he grabbed his pistol from the bedside table and a lantern. He didn't bother with boots or a coat, just stumbled down the stairs and out into the rain, following the humming that seemed to retreat before him. "Show yourself!" he screamed, waving the lantern wildly. "Face me, demon!" The humming led him past the slave cabins, past the cotton fields, to the edge of the swamp. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the treacherous ground ahead. A maze of mud, water, and half-submerged cypress knees. Still the humming continued, now seeming to come from deep within the swamp. Whitfield splashed forward, his nightshirt plastered against his skin, his feet sinking into the soft earth. The lantern light bobbed and wavered, casting monstrous shadows among the trees. "Ruth!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "I know it's you! Stop this torment!" The humming grew fainter, drawing him deeper into the swamp. Near the edge, hidden by darkness and rain, Josiah stood perfectly still. His ears tracked Whitfield's progress by the splash of footsteps and the man's ragged breathing. He knew this swamp by sound and feel. The solid ground, the deadly sinkholes, the places where mud gave way to bottomless mire. Whitfield stumbled forward, following the phantom sound. Lightning flashed again, revealing the unstable ground ahead. But the colonel, blind with fear and rage, didn't see the danger. "Damn you!" he screamed, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. The shots echoed across the water, scattering night birds from their roosts. "Ruth! Ruth!" His next step met nothing solid. With a cry of surprise, more than fear, Whitfield pitched forward. The lantern flew from his hand, hissing out in the mud. For a moment he thrashed, struggling to find purchase in the sucking mire. "Help!" he called, panic rising in his voice as he sank to his waist. "Help me! Someone!" But only the storm answered. Rain pelted down, lightning flashed, and thunder rolled across the sky. The colonel's struggles grew more desperate, then weaker, as the swamp pulled him down inch by inch. Josiah stood motionless in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Whitfield's defeat. The splashing, the gasping, the final bubbling as the mud closed over his head. He felt neither triumph nor horror, only a cold, hollow space where his heart had been. When silence finally returned, broken only by the steady drumming of rain, Josiah turned and walked away from the swamp, Ruth's locket clutched tightly in his hand. Morning came with fog hanging low over the plantation. The air felt heavy with moisture and unspoken words. Birds called nervously from the trees, as if sensing the change that had swept over Whitfield land overnight. Overseer Briggs, who had returned despite being fired when he heard no orders were coming from the big house, trudged through the muddy path toward the swamp. The colonel hadn't been seen since the storm, and Briggs, despite his anger, felt obliged to check on his former employer. The swamp stretched before him, still and quiet in the early light. Something caught his eye, a pale shape half submerged in the dark mud, about 20 yards in. Briggs squinted, then inhaled sharply when recognition hit him. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, splashing forward until the water reached his knees. Colonel Whitfield's body lay face down, one arm stretched out as if reaching for help that never came. His nightshirt, once white, had turned the color of the swamp. Only his head, shoulder, and part of his back remained visible above the muck. Briggs stared for a long moment, then turned and ran back toward the plantation, hollering as he went. "The colonel's dead! The colonel's dead in the swamp!" His cries brought white overseers running. House servants appeared on the porch, watching with wide eyes. In the slave quarters, people exchanged quick glances before lowering their gazes to the ground, hiding whatever feelings flickered in their eyes. By mid-morning, the entire plantation buzzed with the news. 4 men had pulled Whitfield's body from the swamp, loading it onto a cart covered with a sheet. Mud still dripped from the corpse as they rolled it toward the house. "Must have lost his mind and wandered out there," one of the house servants whispered to another while sweeping the porch. "Or the devil finally came to collect what was his," came the quiet reply. Inside the kitchen, the cook crossed herself. "It's Judgment Day. Sure as I'm standing here, the Lord don't sleep." Briggs organized a search of the grounds, suspecting foul play. Men with guns patrolled the boundaries of the plantation, questioning anyone they encountered. The enslaved people gave simple, short answers, their faces carefully blank. "Did you hear anything unusual last night?" Briggs demanded, cornering Josiah outside the workshop where he was sitting on a stool, waiting for instruction. Josiah's unseeing eyes remained fixed straight ahead. His hands rested calmly on his knees. "Just the storm, sir. Thunder was mighty loud. Nothing else? No shouting? No gunshots? My ears ain't what they used to be," Josiah said softly. "The rain on our roof was all I heard." Briggs snorted in disbelief but moved on. No one admitted to hearing or seeing anything unusual, and by sunset, the search was abandoned. The doctor from town declared it an accidental drowning, though rumors of suicide spread quickly among the white families nearby. "Man was acting strange for weeks," Briggs told anyone who would listen. "Talking about ghosts and spirits. Fired me over it." The plantation fell into an uneasy quiet. With no master to give orders, and Briggs hesitant to take full control, work slowed to a crawl. The enslaved people moved carefully, watchful, and waiting. "What happens to us now?" Moses asked Josiah as they sat outside their cabin that evening. "You think they'll sell us off?" Josiah's fingers worked steadily at a piece of wood he was carving. "The colonel has a son up north. Imagine he'll be coming soon enough." As if summoned by his words, a letter arrived 3 days later. Elias Whitfield, the colonel's only son, would arrive from New York within the fortnight to claim his inheritance. Whispers spread through the quarters. Some had memories of young Elias from years before, a quiet boy who'd left for schooling in the north and rarely returned. Others had only heard stories of the colonel's son who'd become too good for plantation life. "They say he reads books about freeing slaves," one field hand murmured. "Don't you believe it?" an older woman warned. "Apple don't fall far from the tree." 12 days after the colonel's death, a fine carriage rolled up the drive. Elias Whitfield had arrived. Taller than his father, but with the same sharp blue eyes, he descended from the carriage dressed in an elegant suit that spoke of city wealth. Unlike his father, Elias spoke in measured tones. He called all the white staff together, along with the house servants, and addressed them from the front porch. "My father's passing grieves me deeply," he said, though his face showed little emotion. "But life must continue, and this plantation must thrive. I intend to bring modern methods to Whitfield land." Briggs stood to the side, hat in hand, looking uncertain. Elias barely acknowledged him. Within days, formal invitations were sent to neighboring families. Elias Whitfield would host a gathering to properly introduce himself and announce his plans. The house was cleaned top to bottom, silver polished, and the best linens brought out. On the evening of the gathering, carriages arrived one after another. Ladies in fine dresses and gentlemen in dark suits filled the parlor and dining room, drinking punch and discussing the strange circumstances of the colonel's death. Midway through the evening, Elias called for attention. The room quieted as he raised his glass. "I thank you all for your warm welcome," he said, his northern accent faint but noticeable. "While my father's methods served him well, I bring a different vision. I believe in reform and Christian decency. This plantation will be a model of modern management, profitable but humane." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked skeptical. "To the future of Whitfield Plantation," Elias concluded, raising his glass higher. The guests drank to his toast, then resumed their conversations with renewed energy, discussing what these changes might mean. In the kitchen, the enslaved servants who had overheard the speech exchanged cautious glances. "You think he means it?" the young girl who served the punch whispered. "We'll see," replied the cook, her face unreadable. "We'll see." Outside, beyond the light and laughter of the big house, Josiah sat alone on a bench near the slave quarters. His fingertip traced letters in the dirt, RUTH, over and over, smoothing them away and starting again. From the mansion came the distant sounds of Elias Whitfield's laughter, eerily similar to his father's. Josiah's head tilted slightly, catching the sound. His expression remained impassive, but his fingers pressed harder into the dirt, deepening the letters of his wife's name. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Dew sparkled on the grass as Josiah made his way across the yard, guided by the tapping of his walking stick. He had been summoned to the main house, a command from the new master that filled him with quiet dread. "This way, Josiah," said Thomas, one of the house servants, taking his elbow at the porch steps. "Master Elias wants you in the study." The floorboards creaked beneath Josiah's feet as Thomas led him through the familiar hallway. Though blind, Josiah had memorized every corner of this house over decades of service. 17 steps from the front door to the study. Turn right. 8 more steps to the center of the room. When the door opened, Josiah could smell pipe tobacco, different from the colonel's harsh blend. This smoke was sweeter, more refined. "Ah, here he is," came Elias Whitfield's voice, educated and smooth. "Thank you, Thomas. You may leave us." The door closed with a soft click. Josiah stood still, hands folded before him, face carefully blank. "I've been examining some of your work, Josiah," Elias said. Josiah heard the sound of wood against wood, one of his carvings being picked up. "These spoons and bowls, the detail is remarkable." "Thank you, Master Whitfield," Josiah replied, his voice low and even. "Please, sit down." Josiah hesitated. The colonel had never invited him to sit in his presence. "Go on," Elias insisted. "There's a chair just behind you." Josiah found the chair with his hands and perched at its edge, back straight, hands resting on his knees. "How long have you been blind?" Elias asked. "Since I was 10, sir. 28 years now. And yet you create such beauty without seeing it." Elias's voice had moved closer. "You are truly a marvel of God's design, to overcome such a limitation." Josiah kept his face still, though the words turned his stomach. A marvel, as if he were some curious animal in a traveling show. "I've invited some friends for dinner tonight," Elias continued. Business associates from town. I'd like you to join us. Confusion rippled through Josiah. Sir? Not as a guest, of course, Elias clarified with a small laugh. I want you to tell them about my father's unfortunate accident, how superstition and fear drove him to his death. The request hung in the air between them. Josiah's fingers tightened slightly against his knees. I didn't see what happened, Master Whitfield. No, but you heard the rumors, the ghost stories, the whispers about my father's state of mind. Elias's voice hardened slightly. These are educated men, Josiah. They'll appreciate a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked imagination. Yes, sir, Josiah replied, understanding washing over him like cold water. He was to be the evening's entertainment, just as he had been for the colonel. Only now, instead of bird calls, he would spin a tale of his former master's madness. Excellent. Someone will fetch you at 7. That evening, Josiah stood before 5 gentlemen in the dining room. Their cigars created a cloud of smoke that tickled his nose. Wine glasses clinked. Silverware scraped against china. Gentlemen, this is Josiah. Elias introduced him. He's been with the Whitfield family since birth. A skilled craftsman despite his blindness, and witness to my father's final days. Fascinating, murmured one of the men. And he can speak properly? Quite well, Elias replied, as if Josiah weren't present. Josiah, please tell my guests what you observed of my father's behavior before his death. Josiah stood with his hands clasped before him, his face a careful mask. Inside, rage burned like a hot coal, but his voice remained steady. The colonel began having troubles sleeping, sirs. Said he heard things at night. A woman singing. Footsteps when nobody was there. The men leaned forward, captivated by the blind man's story. Josiah continued, describing Whitfield's growing paranoia, his firing of the overseer, his wild accusation. With each word, Josiah felt himself becoming smaller, turning back into the colonel's blind pet. How remarkable, one guest commented when he finished. The power of guilt on a fragile mind. Indeed, said Elias. My father was always highly strung, superstitious, despite his education. The conversation continued around him, the men dissecting the colonel's madness like a scientific specimen. Josiah stood silent, forgotten, until Elias finally dismissed him with a wave. That will be all, Josiah. Thank you. As Josiah made his way back to the kitchen, a soft voice stopped him in the hallway. Excuse me. He turned toward the sound, a woman's voice, gentle and touched with a northern accent. Yes, ma'am, he replied. I'm Margaret Whitfield, Elias's wife, she said. I arrived this afternoon while you were in the workshop. Josiah bowed his head slightly. Welcome to Whitfield Plantation, mistress. That display in there was unkind, she said, her voice lowered. I wanted you to know I thought so. Surprise flickered across Josiah's face before he could control it. It's just the way things are, ma'am. Not where I come from, she replied. I've arranged with the housekeeper to have you assigned to the library and garden. You'll have lighter duties. Josiah remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected kindness. 2 days later, Margaret found him in the library, dusting shelves. Josiah, I have something for you, she said, pressing a small wooden block into his hand. Feel this. His fingers traced the surface, finding a raised shape, a straight line with a smaller line across it. That's the letter T, she explained. I've carved all 26 letters. Would you like to learn them? Josiah's heart quickened. The master wouldn't approve, ma'am. My husband spends his days in town on business. What he doesn't know won't trouble him. And so began Josiah's secret education. Each afternoon, Margaret would spend an hour teaching him to read by touch. She brought wooden blocks with raised letters, then progressed to words carved into thin pieces of pine. Josiah learned with astonishing speed, his fingers memorizing the shapes, his mind connecting them to sounds he'd heard all his life, but never been allowed to understand. "You learn faster than any student I taught in Boston," Margaret told him one day, wonder in her voice. "I've been waiting a long time, ma'am," he replied simply. Weeks passed. Josiah mastered the alphabet, then simple words, then sentences. Margaret smuggled a primer from her trunk, one used to teach children in New England schools. Each night, Josiah practiced what he'd learned, tracing letters onto scraps of paper in the cellar where he was allowed to sleep rather than in the slave quarters. One evening, Margaret found him there, his fingers moving rapidly across a page. "You're writing now," she observed, watching as he formed letters with a stub of pencil. "Just practicing, ma'am." She set a candle beside him, its light useless to his blind eyes, but comforting to her. "Knowledge is a kind of light, Josiah," she said softly. His fingers paused over the paper. "Even light can burn, ma'am." 2 days later, Josiah sat in the cellar, running his fingers over a piece of wood carved with the alphabet. The air smelled of damp earth and old vegetables, but it was quiet here, a rare gift on a plantation where privacy was forbidden. The door creaked open. Josiah quickly tucked the wooden letters into his pocket. "It's only me," Margaret whispered, her footsteps light on the packed dirt floor. "I've brought something new today." Josiah relaxed slightly, turning his face toward her voice. "Good afternoon, Mistress Margaret." "I have papers," she said, sitting beside him on a wooden crate. "Real reading material, not just practice letters." He heard the rustle of paper as she pulled something from beneath her shawl. She took his hand and guided it to the pamphlet. "This is different," Josiah said, his sensitive fingers detecting the thin, crisp texture. "Not like the primer." "These are pamphlets from the North," Margaret explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Written by abolitionists, people who believe slavery should end." Josiah's heart began to pound. Even possessing such material was dangerous, especially for him. "Feel here." Margaret guided his fingers to the top of the page. "The title reads, The Liberty Bell. Can you make out the letters?" Slowly, carefully, Josiah traced each raised letter the way she had taught him. T-H-E, L-I-B-E-R-T-Y, B-E-L-L. "Very good," Margaret encouraged. "Now try the first sentence." His fingers moved delicately across the page, feeling the slight impression of each printed letter. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The words burned into his mind like fire. All men created equal. He had heard such ideas whispered among the enslaved, but never printed plainly on paper like an undeniable truth. "There's more," Margaret said, turning the page for him. "This one describes the work of Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery and became a great speaker." For over an hour, they sat in the dim cellar as Josiah read sentence after sentence about freedom, about enslaved people who had escaped north, about movements to end the institution that had claimed his life and Ruth's. Each word opened something within him, a dangerous hope. "Your fingers understand the letters better than my eyes do sometimes," Margaret remarked. "When you've lived in darkness, ma'am, you learn to see with other parts," Josiah replied. Margaret sighed, shifting on her crate. Her hand moved briefly to her stomach. "Josiah, I have news of my own. I'm expecting a child." "Congratulations, ma'am," Josiah said automatically, though he sensed hesitation in her voice. "Yes, it's a blessing," she agreed. "But I worry about bringing a child into this place." She paused. "The estate. It's not doing well. Elias doesn't say much, but I've seen the ledgers. There are debts, many debts." Josiah kept his face carefully neutral. "The cotton harvest was poor last year. Too much rain." "It's more than that," Margaret said. "The colonel borrowed heavily before he died. Elias inherited those debts, along with the land." A knot of unease formed in Josiah's stomach. Debt meant trouble, and trouble always fell hardest on the enslaved. "Will you keep teaching me?" he asked, changing the subject. "As long as I can," she promised. But something in her voice had changed. A new tension, a new fear. Over the next week, Josiah noticed changes around the plantation. Meals grew smaller. Work hours lengthened. Elias spent less time entertaining guests and more time locked in his study, his voice often rising in anger during meetings with his overseer. One afternoon, as Josiah swept the hallway outside Elias's study, the door remained slightly ajar. Inside, Elias and Briggs were deep in conversation. "The bank won't extend the loan," Elias was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to liquidate some assets before winter." "The South Field could wait another season," Briggs suggested. "Not enough," Elias snapped. "We need immediate capital. I'm thinking of the human inventory." The broom nearly slipped from Josiah's hands. "How many?" Briggs asked. "At least 8, possibly 10. The blind man for certain. He's just an extra mouth with little value." "Shame," Briggs commented. "He makes those nice carvings." "Trinkets," Elias dismissed. "My wife coddles him, but sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. Make the arrangements for next month's auction in Richmond." Josiah continued sweeping, his movements mechanical, his mind racing. He had always known his position was precarious, but hearing himself discussed as inventory made the reality brutally clear. That evening, as he finished his chores in the kitchen, he heard soft sobbing from the parlor. Moving silently through the hallway, he recognized Margaret's voice and another, Elias's, unusually gentle. "It's the only way, Margaret," Elias was saying. "We must secure our future, our child's future." "But selling people," Margaret protested weakly. It's business," Elias cut her off. "These difficult decisions are why women shouldn't trouble themselves with financial matters." "Josiah, too?" she asked, her voice small. "Especially him. What use is a blind slave except as a curiosity? And you've wasted hours teaching him letters he'll never need." A long silence followed. "Yes, husband," Margaret finally replied. Josiah stepped back, his chest tight. The realization was like ice water. Margaret's kindness had never been rebellion. It was merely guilt, easing her conscience while still benefiting from the system that kept him chained. Late that night, Josiah sat alone by the small fire pit behind the workshop. In his hands were the wooden spoons, bowls, and figurines he had carved over years, the trinkets that had earned him favor and protection. One by one, he cast them into the flames. The dry wood caught quickly, the fire consuming the work of his hands. Last to go were the wooden alphabet blocks Margaret had made for him. "No more toys for their amusement," he whispered as they burned. The flames reflected in his sightless eyes, dancing with orange light that he could feel but never see. In that heat, something hardened inside him, not just anger, but resolve. Knowledge was indeed light, as Margaret had said. But she had been wrong about one thing. Light didn't just illuminate, it could also destroy. Morning sunlight streamed through the study windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. Elias Whitfield sat at his father's old mahogany desk, a stack of cream-colored stationery before him. The scratch of his pen was rhythmic, deliberate. He paused occasionally to dip the nib in ink, then continued his careful script. "To Mr. Harrison Blackwood," Elias murmured as he wrote, "regarding the auction of prime field hands scheduled for the 15th of next month." Outside in the hallway, Josiah stood motionless, broom in hand. His ears caught every word, every pause, every subtle sound. The soft tap when Elias set down his pen, the distinctive rustle of paper being folded, the wet sound of his tongue sealing an envelope. He had been listening for days now, memorizing the patterns of Elias's speech, the cadence of his formal letters. 6 healthy men, 2 women of childbearing age, Elias continued dictating to himself, and 1 elderly blind man, suitable for light household duties. Josiah's fingers tightened around the broom handle. His face remained blank, a mask he had perfected over decades. "Expect minimum returns of $800 per head," Elias concluded, sealing the final envelope with a drop of hot wax. He pressed his signet ring into it, creating the distinctive Whitfield family crest. The door opened suddenly. Josiah immediately resumed sweeping, his movements practiced and unobtrusive. "Still cleaning this hallway, are you?" Elias asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Yes, Master Elias," Josiah replied, keeping his head bowed. "Dust settles quick in summer. Well, move on to the parlor. Margaret's expecting guests this afternoon." "Right away, sir." Josiah moved down the hallway, counting steps in his mind. Behind him, he heard Elias call for a house servant to deliver the letters. The plan forming in Josiah's mind solidified a little more. That night, after the house fell silent, Josiah crept into the study. His fingers found the desk, the inkwell, the spare stationery Elias kept in the top drawer. Years of navigating blindness had given him perfect knowledge of spaces, where things were placed, how to move without disturbing objects. He had stolen a sheet of paper earlier that day, hiding it beneath his shirt. Now, sitting in Elias's chair, he placed it on the desk. From his pocket, he removed a small piece of charcoal he'd taken from the kitchen fireplace. Josiah had been practicing for weeks in secret, first tracing letters in dirt, then attempting to write them himself. Margaret's lessons had opened a door, though she never intended where it would lead. His fingers worked carefully, mimicking the strokes he'd memorized from feeling Elias's handwriting on pressed paper. The letter began, "To Mr. Jonah Phillips, Boston Mercantile Bank." Josiah wrote slowly, his sightless eyes staring ahead while his sensitive fingers guided the charcoal. He'd memorized the formal language Elias used with creditors, the specific terminology of business transactions. In the letter, Elias offered to sell 50 acres of the Eastern Plantation lands at a desperate discount to cover immediate debts. The tone was urgent, but maintained dignity, exactly as the real Elias would write while hiding his panic. When finished, Josiah practiced the signature at the bottom several times on a scrap, then carefully signed the letter. He would need to replace the charcoal marks with ink before sending it, but this night's work was just practice. The real letters would come soon. Over the next week, Josiah perfected his plan. He stole small amounts of ink, sealing wax, and paper. He convinced a young house servant boy, Thomas, that Master Elias had asked for letters to be quietly delivered to the mail coach. Private business matters. "But why you?" Thomas had asked. "Master trusts me because I can't read what I'm handling," Josiah had lied. "Says his business is his own." The first real forged letter went out 3 days later, not to a bank, but to a known abolitionist lawyer in Philadelphia. In it, Elias Whitfield expressed growing moral qualms about slavery and inquired about selling his plantation to Northern investors who might gradually free the workers. 2 more letters followed to different banks, each subtly contradicting the others about Elias's financial plans. Meanwhile, Josiah began planting seeds of doubt among the house staff. "Master seems troubled," he whispered to the cook one evening, talking to himself just like his father did before the end. To Margaret's maid, "Strange how Master Elias keeps changing his mind about the auction. First it's happening, then it's not. Makes a person wonder if he's well." To Thomas, "Did you notice Master going through the same papers over and over? Reminds me of old Master Whitfield before the swamp took him." The rumors spread like wildfire. Servants began watching Elias with wary eyes. When letters arrived requesting clarification about his contradictory business proposals, Elias's confusion was obvious to all. "I never wrote to any abolitionists," he shouted one afternoon, throwing a letter into the fire. "Someone is attempting to ruin me." His rage grew as more responses arrived to letters he never wrote. Banks questioned his creditworthiness. Business partners expressed concern about his stability. One evening, as Josiah polished silverware in the dining room, he overheard Elias and Margaret arguing. "You must calm yourself," Margaret pleaded. "Think of the child. Don't tell me to calm myself when everything I've built is collapsing." Elias slammed his hand on the table. "First these mysterious letters, then the bank freezing our accounts. Someone is sabotaging us. Perhaps if you didn't shout at every servant, accusing them of conspiracy. Because one of them is conspiring against me," Elias roared. Margaret's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "You sound just like your father." Silence followed. Heavy, threatening silence. Then the sound of a slap. Margaret's muffled cry. Josiah kept polishing, his face impassive. Each day, Elias grew more paranoid. He fired 2 house servants for suspicious behavior. He began locking himself in the study for hours. Dark circles formed under his eyes from lack of sleep. The resemblance to his father's final days became impossible to ignore. That evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Elias burst into the parlor, where Margaret sat, sewing baby clothes. Josiah was nearby, dusting the mantelpiece. "It's happening again," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Just like with father. Someone is undermining me, whispering against me, turning my own house against me." Margaret looked up, fear plain on her face. "Elias, please. The bank says I've requested to sell the East Fields. The lumber mill says I've canceled our contract. Phillips in Boston claims I've offered the entire plantation as collateral." His eyes were wild, his cravat loosened and askew. "I'm being destroyed by invisible hands." Josiah moved silently toward the door, his dusting cloth in hand. As he passed behind Elias, he leaned slightly closer and whispered, so softly it might have been the wind, "Some debts can't be paid in gold, master." Elias whirled around, his face white. "What? What did you say?" Josiah kept his face blank, already 3 steps away. "Sir?" I didn't speak. "I heard you!" Elias advanced on him. "You said something about debts." "Elias, he said nothing," Margaret intervened, rising awkwardly with her growing belly. "I was watching him." Elias looked between them, doubt and fear battling in his eyes. "I heard it. I know I heard it." His hand trembled as he pushed past Josiah into the hallway. Josiah resumed his dusting, his sightless eyes staring at nothing, his face betraying not even a hint of the satisfaction blooming inside him. Rain clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and dark like bruises against the afternoon sky. Elias Whitfield paced the length of his study, his fine boots wearing a path in the carpet. Papers trembled in his hand. Letters from the Charleston National Bank bearing terrible news. Accounts suspended. Suspicious activity. Authorization required. He read aloud, his voice cracking. "This is madness. Pure madness." He slammed the papers onto his desk, knocking over an inkwell. Black liquid spread across the polished mahogany like blood. "Wilson!" he shouted for his house servant. "Wilson, damn you!" But Wilson had been dismissed 3 days prior, accused of theft, when Elias found plantation records missing. The house felt emptier each day as servants disappeared. Some fired in Elias's fits of paranoia, others slipping away in the night. Only Josiah remained constant, moving through the house like a shadow, always nearby, yet somehow untouchable. The front door banged open. Elias hurried to the entrance hall to find 3 men in dark coats standing in his foyer, rain sprinkling their shoulders. "Mr. Whitfield?" The tallest man stepped forward, removing his hat. "Simon Thornhill, representing the North American Anti-Slavery Society." "What business do you have here?" Elias demanded, straightening his vest. "We've come to finalize the transfer of the East Cotton Field," Thornhill said, producing a folded document. "As per your agreement, to convert the property to paid labor." Elias snatched the paper. "I made no such agreement." Your signature suggests otherwise, sir. Thornhill pointed to the bottom of the page. There it was, Elias Whitfield, written in what appeared to be his own hand. The same elegant loops, the same distinctive cross of the T. "This is a forgery," Elias whispered. Then louder, "This is a forgery! Sir, we have 6 letters from you, all consistent in tone and hand," said the second man, stepping forward, "along with transfer documents for the mill property and the north pasture." "I never wrote those letters." Elias's face flushed crimson. Someone in this house is—" His eyes darted around the room, searching for a culprit. They landed on Josiah, who stood quietly in the corner, hands folded before him. "You!" Elias hissed. "Sir?" Josiah's face remained placid, his blind eyes staring at nothing. "How? How could a blind—" Elias caught himself, aware of the abolitionists watching. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I must ask you to leave immediately." "Mr. Whitfield, these documents are legally binding," Thornhill insisted. "Your property transfers have already been recorded at the county offices." Lightning flashed outside, followed by a crack of thunder. The storm had arrived. "Get out!" Elias shouted, reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Get off my property now!" The men backed toward the door, Thornhill saying calmly, "We'll return with the sheriff, sir. Violence won't serve your interests." As they left, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching their infant son to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Elias, what's happening?" she asked, voice trembling. "Pack your things," he ordered, not looking at her. "We're leaving tonight." "Leaving? But the storm—" "Tonight!" he roared, turning on her with such fury that she flinched back. "Everything is falling apart. Can't you see that? This house, this land, it's all being stolen from under us." Margaret stared at him, then looked to Josiah, who remained in the corner, motionless. Something passed between them. A moment of understanding. "Very well," she said quietly. "I'll pack for myself and the baby." She disappeared upstairs while Elias returned to his study, frantically gathering papers. Rain lashed at the windows now, driven by howling wind. An hour later, Margaret descended with a small trunk and the baby wrapped in blankets. But instead of joining Elias, she slipped out the side door to where a carriage waited, arranged earlier that day with help from her lady's maid. "Tell him I couldn't stay," she whispered to Josiah, who had appeared silently beside the door. "Not with how he's become?" "Safe journey, Mrs. Whitfield," Josiah replied softly. As the carriage pulled away through the storm, Elias's voice echoed through the empty house. "Margaret! Margaret!" He thundered down the stairs to find Josiah standing alone in the hallway. "Where is she?" Elias demanded, grabbing Josiah by the shirt. "Gone, master," Josiah answered calmly. "She feared for the child." Elias released him with a shove. "She abandoned me? Now, when everything is—" His voice trailed off as he heard it, soft at first, then growing clearer, humming. A woman's voice, humming the same tune Ruth had hummed while working. "What is that?" he whispered. "Who's singing?" The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, down hallways, through walls, from outside the windows. It was the same melody that had driven his father to madness, but now Josiah's lips moved slightly, matching the tune. "It's you!" Elias breathed, realization dawning. "It was always you." Josiah said nothing, his unseeing eyes somehow penetrating despite their blindness. The humming grew louder, merging with the storm's wail. Elias clapped his hands over his ears, but couldn't block it out. It was inside his head now, under his skin. "Stop it!" he screamed. "Stop it!" He grabbed a lantern from the wall and the hunting rifle he'd threatened the abolitionists with. Just as his father had done months before, he burst out into the storm, desperate to escape the sound. Rain pelted his face as he staggered across the muddy yard toward the swamp that bordered the plantation's edge. The humming followed, floating on the wind. Or was it in his mind? He couldn't tell anymore. "I know you're out there!" he shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself!" Behind him, the door to the big house opened. Josiah stepped out, face turned up to feel the rain. He didn't need a lantern. Darkness had been his companion all his life. He followed the sounds of Elias's frantic movements, splashing footsteps, breaking branches, panicked breathing. The swamp welcomed Elias with deceptive softness. The ground grew spongier with each step, mud sucking at his fine leather boots. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the treacherous landscape for brief, terrifying moments. "This is my land," he screamed into the storm. "Mine!" Josiah moved carefully along the swamp's edge, his bare feet feeling every root and depression. The storm's noise was a map he could read. The direction of the rain, the echo of Elias's voice against trees, the distinctive sound of mud pulling at desperate feet. Another flash of lightning revealed Elias struggling in deepening mire, his lantern held high, rifle abandoned. "Help!" he called, suddenly afraid. "Someone help me!" "No one's coming," Josiah's voice came from the darkness. Just as no one came for Ruth. Elias froze, his wild eyes searching the shadows. "Josiah! Get help! I'm sinking!" Lightning flashed again. Josiah stood 10 paces away, face calm despite the rain streaming down it. "You're standing in your father's grave," Josiah said quietly, "the same bog that took him." "Pull me out," Elias begged, the mud now at his knees. "For God's sake." "God isn't here," Josiah replied. "Just the dead beneath your feet?" The lantern slipped from Elias's hand, falling into the mud with a hiss as its flame died. Darkness swallowed them both. "How?" Elias gasped, still struggling. "How did a blind man orchestrate all this?" "You saw only what you wanted to see," Josiah answered. "Now you see nothing at all." Lightning flashed one final time. The mud had reached Elias's waist, pulling him deeper with each movement. "Now you see," Josiah whispered as darkness returned. The swamp bubbled and shifted. Then silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain. Dawn broke like a whisper over Whitfield Plantation. Pale golden light spilled across fields that had drunk the night's rain, turning mud to mist that hovered ghost-like above the earth. The big house stood silent, its white columns streaked with dirt, its windows dark and hollow. Thin trails of smoke rose from neglected chimneys where fires had burned low overnight, untended. The slave quarters stirred with uncertain movement. Men and women emerged from doorways, speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the mansion with a mixture of hope and fear. No bell had rung to call them to work. No overseer stood with whip in hand. The previous day's chaos had scattered the white staff like leaves in a storm. The foreman gone, the house servants dismissed, and now both master and mistress vanished. Josiah sat on the steps of his cabin, head tilted as though listening to the morning itself. His fingers traced the edges of papers carefully hidden in his shirt pocket. The forgeries had served their purpose, but so had the real documents he'd discovered while cleaning Elias's study, learning their contents through Margaret's reluctant readings. "What happens now, Josiah?" asked old Samuel, the oldest among them, his voice cracking with age and worry. "They'll send men looking for the master." Others gathered around, their faces showing the same question. Without masters or overseers, they stood in a terrible, wonderful uncertainty. Freedom hovered before them, yet danger pressed at their backs. Josiah rose slowly. "Gather everyone," he said. "By the big oak." Word spread quickly. Within the hour, 43 souls, every enslaved person remaining on the plantation, stood beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed generations of their suffering. Children clung to mothers' skirts. Men stood with shoulders tense, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. Josiah moved to the center of the group, his steps careful but certain. From his pocket, he withdrew the papers, holding them up for all to see. "These papers," he began, his voice stronger than many had ever heard it, "tell the truth that the Whitfields tried to hide. This plantation is drowning in debt. The bank owns more of it than the master ever did." He handed the first document to Samuel, who squinted at it in wonder. "And these," Josiah continued, producing more papers, "are transfer deeds signed by Master Elias himself, selling portions of the land to northern abolitionists." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "How do you know what they say?" asked a woman named Esther. "You can't see the words." Josiah smiled slightly. "Margaret Whitfield taught me to read by touch, and I've memorized every word on these pages." He ran his fingers across one document. "This one says the Eastfields now belong to the Anti-Slavery Society. This one shows the bank will claim the house and remaining lands within 30 days. Where is the master now?" someone called out. "Gone," Josiah answered simply, "like his father before him. The swamp claimed them both." A heavy silence fell. Everyone understood what wasn't being said. "The mistress fled north with her child last night," Josiah continued. "The overseers and house staff have abandoned their posts. There is no one left to claim ownership over any soul standing here." Samuel stepped forward, his gnarled hand trembling as he touched one of the papers. "What does this mean for us?" "We got no safe place to go. There are Union camps north of here," Josiah said. 3 days' journey by the river path. I've heard the soldiers talking about them when they visited the master." "Union soldiers?" Esther's voice shook. "They'll just capture us and send us back." "Not anymore," said Josiah. "The war has changed things. The papers say Lincoln is making proclamations. Any slave reaching Union lines will be considered free." Hope flickered across faces that had rarely known it, but fear lingered too. "We should go now," Josiah said, "before anyone comes looking for Elias. Take only what you can carry: food, warm clothes, anything of value that might be traded. We leave at sunrise." As the group dispersed to prepare, Samuel stayed behind with Josiah. "You planned all this," the old man said quietly. "Since they killed Ruth." Josiah's hand went to the small locket hanging around his neck, the only thing of Ruth's he had managed to keep. "Ruth showed me that even the strongest chains have weak links," he answered. "The Whitfields believed blindness made me helpless. Their mistake. By first light, they were ready. 43 souls gathered at the edge of the property, bundles on backs, children held close. Many had never stepped foot beyond the plantation's boundaries. Some wept silently, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. Josiah led them along paths he knew by sound and memory, the specific crunch of pine needles, the way wind moved differently through oak branches versus maple, the subtle change in birdsong as they traveled north. His blindness, once a prison, had become their guide in a world where seeing too much could mean capture or death. They walked through that day and the next, moving mostly at night, resting in hidden groves during daylight. On the third morning, they reached the wide river that marked the border between counties. The smell of water filled Josiah's senses, rich, alive, moving. He knelt at the riverbank, feeling cool mud beneath his knees. Behind him, the others prepared to cross on a series of small boats they'd found abandoned along the shore. The rising sun warmed Josiah's face as he tilted it upward. In the far distance, beyond the river, came the low rumble of cannon fire, the sound of the war that was tearing the country apart, yet somehow stitching together a new future. He smiled, fingers closing around Ruth's locket. "They said I was born blind, but the only ones who never saw the truth were those who called themselves free." I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.